Hello, Hwa Chong students. I'm Mr. Kelvin Tan. Welcome again to online learning. So in this video, I'll be teaching you all what do we mean by pattern or trait. Okay, with that, right, I'll also show you how to apply your understanding to answer essay 3A in your tutorial, which is the determinants of the pattern or trait between Singapore and the rest of the world. In your introduction, the key concept to clarify is what do we mean by pattern or trait. So here, the pattern or trait refers to the composition of a country's exports and imports, as well as her trading partners. So the two underlying term makes it clear, right? We are trying to figure out who sells what to whom. So we are talking about the composition of the goods of a countries, what are the exports and what are the imports, and who do we trade with. So Singapore engages in both inter-industry trade and intra-industry trade. Okay, so the inter-industry trade is determined by the theory of CA, whereas for intra-industry trade can be determined by taste and preferences as well as government policies. So in your body, right, the first thing to cover will be inter-industry trade. So this relies on the theory of comparative advantage. We have already covered the introduction, the law of comparative advantage in your tutorial lessons. So for this essay, okay, you should focus on linking factor endowments of a country to comparative advantage. There was a previous video lesson in this online learning that you can refer to. This lesson, right, will focus more on pattern or trait, which is the commodity composition, means what goods do we export and import, as well as the geographical composition, whom do we trade with. Applying the lessons from the previous video, so when it comes to commodity composition or trade, you will talk about comparative advantage. So how do we link factor endowment to comparative advantage? So to remind you of what we learned in the last video, ask yourself this question. Which factor of production will you classify Singapore as being relatively factor abundant in? So after a while, right, you will conclude that Singapore, we are pretty proud of our well-educated and trained workforce. So this means that we are likely to be relatively abundant in skilled labor. Our infrastructure is also pretty good. We have plenty of industrial parks. We have a lot of communication and transport facilities. So we can call us relatively capital abundant. And finally, we are blessed with advanced technology. Because of our skilled workforce, we are able to do things like IT, robotics, and automation quite well. So we are relatively abundant in skilled labor, in technology, as well as relatively capital abundant. So if you want to match these factor abundance to the goods, right? Which are the goods that also happen to be relatively skilled labor intensive, relatively capital intensive, as well as relatively technological intensive? So some examples would be electronics, disk drives, wafer fabs, okay, pharmaceuticals, petrochemicals, oil rigs, and ship repair. All these goods require relatively more skilled labor, capital, and technology. Our comparative advantage is also in services. Okay, in order to provide good services, you need to have skilled workforce. So in terms of water management, hospital management, airport management. So many tourists will actually come to our country for our hospital, for medical services. Once you are clear about our relative factor abundance, think which are the factors of production would Singapore be relatively scarce in. So we are definitely short of land, we have almost no mineral deposits, we do not have a favorable climate for agriculture activities because it's constantly hot. Okay, many of these agriculture goods require the 4 seasons. We are also scarce in unskilled workers due to our small population size. So if you match these factors, right, goods that are relatively land intensive, goods that are relatively unskilled labor intensive, so these goods will be agriculture, vegetables, okay, meat, fruit, eggs, primary commodities, coal, okay, oil, okay, but take note of my last video, right, we talked about extension 3, if you recall, right, we may not have a comparative advantage in crude oil because Singapore doesn't lie on top of an oil field. However, to transform crude oil into refined oil, just like to transform rainwater to drinking water, transforming crude oil to refined oil requires capital, is capital intensive, skilled labor intensive, as well as technological intensive. So even though Singapore does not have a comparative advantage in crude oil, we do have a comparative advantage in refining the oil. So we export a lot of refined oil. Okay, we also don't have a comparative advantage in low-end manufactured goods such as textiles, okay, sports shoes, bicycles, and toys. So in our standard numerical illustration of CA, we tend to use goods belonging to different industries. So cars versus corn, iPhone versus rice. So once you understand what is factor endowment concept, right, you're able to easily explain why is it that United States, they have a CA in producing cars or iPhones, while developing countries, right, like Thailand, will tend to have a CA in producing corn or rice. That will be inter-industry trade. What about intra-industry trade? So in reality, right, we also observe different countries trading different varieties of the same goods. So one classic example would be cars. In Germany, okay, they export cars to Japan, and the Germans also import cars from Japan. So this is the same industry, right, cars, but they are trading different varieties of cars. So in such cases, we do not use comparative advantage to explain this kind of international trade. Instead, we say that international trade in goods and services still take place between these two countries, Japan and Germany, because of difference in taste and preference. Consumers of both countries benefit from access to a wider choice of goods. So for example, right, some Germans love the compact and cheaper Japanese cars such as Toyota. Likewise, there will be some Japanese who love the sturdy and well-built German cars like Volkswagen and BMW. The classic joke that sometimes cracks is that when a German car crashes against a Japanese car, okay, the Japanese car will be crushed almost all the way, whereas the German cars will remain as one piece. Okay, so some Japanese may love that kind of protection offered by well-built German cars. So this is a trade based on different taste and preference. So that is about commodity composition of trade. So let's move on to the geographical composition of trade. So we have linked relative factor abundance to relative factor intensity to determine the commodity composition. Now let us explain geographical composition. Who does Singapore trade the most with and why? Okay, you realize that we tend to trade with other countries that may not be the lowest op cost in producing certain goods. Okay, but we still trade with them. So we are not exactly following the law of CA here. Why is that? So here, right, recall when we tried to prove the law of CA in your tutorial lessons, right, there was a whole shopping list of assumptions, right? So here we are going to relax some of the assumptions we made when we are trying to prove the law of CA to understand what is geographical composition. First point is this. Singapore, we tend to trade more with countries that we sign FTA in. So why is this? So if you recall, right, one of your assumptions when you try to prove the law of CA is that there's no import tariff or trade restrictions between countries. However, in reality, many countries impose various trade restrictions, so these would naturally restrict trade. So what happens is that we tend to trade more with countries that we sign FTAs with. So this explains one aspect of our geographical composition of trade. So some elaboration. Since the signing of the first FTA, so Singapore, Malaysia, okay, and some other countries, we are part of this ASEAN Free Trade Area in 1993. So over the years, right, we have signed many FTAs that covers various countries around the world. So why do we sign all these FTAs? It's because it allows our businesses, right, to be able to export goods and services to these countries without being taxed. Okay, without being levied import tax. So this provides us easing of investment rules, improving intellectual property regulation, as well as opening up for government procurement opportunities. Okay, so that's about trade restriction. We relax the assumption. The other assumption we're going to relax now is that we're going to relax the assumption of zero transport costs. So one assumption we made when we proved the law of CA is that there's no transport cost. So in the real world, right, that doesn't hold. So we tend to trade more with countries that are closer to us geographically. This explains our huge volume of trade with Malaysia. Much of our eggs, right, are typically imported from there because to transport eggs, right, from one place to another, there's a high chance of eggs being broken. So because of that, by buying the eggs from Malaysia, there's lower transport costs. So even if Malaysia, right, may not have the lowest op cost in producing eggs compared to, let's say, some other country far, far away from us. Another example I like to use, right, is about crude oil. Okay, are you aware that Singapore, right, we tend to get most of our crude oil from Brunei? Now you can imagine, right, there'll be some country in the Middle East, Iran, Iraq. They probably have a much lower opportunity cost in producing crude oil than Brunei. Okay, because a rich oil field, right, are situated in the Middle East. But because to transport crude oil from one place to another, right, the transport cost is also pretty high. So even though Brunei may not have the lowest op cost in producing crude oil, the transport cost makes it such that it is still cheaper for us, right, to get most of our crude oil from Brunei than to source it from a Middle Eastern country. So, in conclusion, right, from the above explanation, it can be inferred that the most important determinant of Singapore's pattern of trade is the principle of comparative advantage. This is because a large part of our Singapore's trade is precisely based on the inter-industry model. So currently, right, our comparative advantage based on our factor endowment lies in the export of high-end manufactured goods and services. This pattern is clearly aligned with our resource endowment.